The morning sun cast long shadows across Ravenwood School for Girls as autumn leaves danced in the crisp New England breeze. The year was 1987, and this prestigious boarding school stood like a castle from an old fairy tale, with its towering stone walls and windows that seemed to watch your every move. But unlike fairy tales, the story that unfolded here wasn't made up, it was terrifyingly real. Picture walking through those giant wooden doors for the first time. That's what dozens of young girls did that September, their designer suitcases rolling behind them, their parents' expensive cars pulling away down the tree-lined driveway. The school looked perfect from the outside, maybe too perfect. The grass was always freshly cut, the flowers bloomed in perfectly straight lines, and even the ivy climbing the walls seemed to know exactly where it should and shouldn't grow. The school's brochure bragged about its 100-year history of molding young minds into tomorrow's leaders. Rich families from all over the country sent their daughters here, hoping they'd follow in the footsteps of famous alumni, successful lawyers, doctors, and politicians. The tuition cost more than most people made in a year, but parents thought it was worth every penny. After all, this was Ravenwood, the crown jewel of East Coast education. Inside those grand halls, everything sparkled. The marble floors were so shiny you could see your reflection in them. Ancient oil paintings of stern-looking headmistresses lined the walls, their eyes following students as they hurried to class in their pressed uniforms, navy blue blazers, plaid skirts, and polished black shoes. The whole place smelled like old books and lemon furniture polish. But if you looked closer, really closer, things weren't quite as perfect as they seemed. There were whispers in the corridors, strange sounds at night that nobody could explain, doors that were always locked, even though they hadn't been used in years. And some of the older teachers, they had this look in their eyes like they knew something they weren't telling. The library was especially creepy after dark. Row after row of dusty books reached up to the ceiling, and the old wooden shelves made weird creaking sounds even when nobody was around. Girls would swear they saw shadows moving between the aisles when they studied late at night. But everyone laughed it off. Ghost stories were just part of going to an old school, right? Behind the main building, there was this massive garden maze. The hedges were taller than any of the students, and rumor had it that back in the 1950s, a girl had gotten lost in there for 2 whole days. The school said that was just a silly story, but they still kept the maze locked up after sunset. Some students swore they could hear voices coming from it late at night. That fall started like any other. New students got lost trying to find their classrooms, seniors bragged about college applications, and everyone complained about the mystery meat in the dining hall. Nobody knew they were about to live through the darkest chapter in Ravenwood's history. Nobody saw the warning signs, the way certain teachers would suddenly stop talking when students walked by, or how the headmistress kept having secret meetings with people who never signed in at the front desk. The first hint that something was wrong came when students noticed extra security cameras being installed around campus. The school said it was just routine upgrades, but why did they need cameras pointing at the old service tunnels that nobody had used in decades? And why did the night guard quit so suddenly, after 20 years on the job? What happened next would shock not just the school, but the entire country. It would make national headlines, spark FBI investigations, and change the laws about boarding school safety forever. But on that cool autumn morning, as leaves crunched under students' feet and chapel bells rang across campus, nobody at Ravenwood knew that 3 of their classmates were about to vanish into thin air. Looking back, there were clues everywhere. The weird noises from the basement that the maintenance staff ignored. The new locks on the archive room doors. The way some of the old yearbooks had pages mysteriously torn out. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight, and by the time anyone connected the dots, it would be too late for those 3 girls. The story of what really happened at Ravenwood School for Girls isn't just about missing students or dark secrets. It's about power, privilege, and what happens when the people we trust to protect our children have other plans. It's about the dark things that can hide behind beautiful facades, and how sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones walking among us, wearing friendly smiles and expensive suits. The first disappearance happened on a Thursday evening in October, when the air was getting colder and darkness crept in earlier each day. One of the brightest juniors at Ravenwood, A girl with long brown hair who always sat in the front row never showed up for evening check-in. At first, nobody panicked. Maybe she'd fallen asleep in the library again, something she'd done before during finals week. Her roommate wasn't worried at first. They'd talked just a few hours earlier about their chemistry test the next day. The missing girl had been heading to the library, carrying her favorite blue backpack and wearing the school's standard navy blazer. "I'll be back before curfew," she'd said, just like she always did. But this time was different. This time she wouldn't come back at all. When 9 p.m. rolled around and she still hadn't returned, her roommate started making calls. The library, empty. The study rooms, all locked up for the night. The dining hall, dark and quiet. With each passing minute, the knot in everyone's stomach grew tighter. This wasn't like her at all. She was the responsible one, the girl who'd never missed a curfew in 2 years at Ravenwood. By 10 p.m., the school staff finally started taking it seriously. Security guards swept the campus with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. They found her usual study spot in the library exactly as she would have left it. Textbooks neatly stacked, color-coded notes spread out, even her half-finished cup of tea now cold. But she was gone. Near the garden maze, they'd found something that made everyone's blood run cold. Her navy blue blazer, lying crumpled on the ground. It wasn't like her to leave her clothes lying around. She was always perfectly put together. And there was something else strange. Despite the damp ground, the blazer was completely dry, as if it hadn't been there long at all. The police arrived shortly before midnight. They asked all the usual questions. Did she have a boyfriend? Problems at home? Any reason to run away? But her friends just kept shaking their heads. She was happy here. Her grades were perfect. She'd just been accepted into a prestigious summer program at Harvard. Running away made no sense. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and news vans. Local reporters camped outside the school gates, their cameras flashing every time someone walked by. Inside, the halls of Ravenwood felt different, quieter, darker somehow. Girls started walking in groups, even to the bathroom. Nobody wanted to be alone anymore. Her parents arrived the next morning, their faces pale with worry. They stood in the headmistress's office, looking at the security footage that showed their daughter walking toward the library at 6:43 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw her. The cameras that should have shown her leaving the library weren't working that night, a technical glitch, the school claimed. The police brought in dogs to search the grounds. They'd picked up her scent from the blazer and followed it to the garden maze, but then something strange happened. The dogs just stopped. Right at the maze entrance, they sat down and refused to go further. Even the most experienced canine units wouldn't enter. The handlers said they'd never seen anything like it. As days turned into weeks, the investigation hit one dead end after another. The school hired private security, installed more cameras, and set up a tip line. But it felt like too little, too late. Parents started asking uncomfortable questions. Why weren't all the security cameras working that night? Why did it take so long to start searching? And why did the headmistress seem more worried about the school's reputation than finding a missing student? Students started noticing other strange things too, like how certain teachers would change the subject when asked about previous incidents of the school, or how the maintenance staff suddenly blocked off an old hallway in the basement, claiming it was unsafe. And then there were the nighttime noises, sounds like distant footsteps and muffled voices coming from parts of the building that were supposed to be empty. The girl's room stayed exactly as she'd left it. Her bed was still neatly made, her clothes hanging in perfect order in the closet. On her desk, a calendar showed all her carefully planned study sessions and activities. The next day had chemistry test, written in purple ink with 3 exclamation points. She'd been so worried about that test. Now it seemed like such a small thing. Nobody knew it then, but this was just the beginning. In the months that followed, 2 more girls would vanish from Ravenwood, each disappearance more mysterious than the last. But it was this first one that changed everything, the moment when everyone realized that something very wrong was happening behind those prestigious walls. The question wasn't just where had she gone, but what dark secrets was this school hiding? And who would be next? Winter came early to Ravenwood that year. By December, thick snow blanketed the campus, muffling sounds and making the old buildings look like something out of a snow globe. But there was nothing peaceful about it. The first girl's disappearance had left a wound that wouldn't heal, and everyone could feel that something wasn't right. The second disappearance happened on a Monday evening, just as the sun was setting. This time, it was one of the senior students, a quiet girl known for her incredible talent at the piano. She practiced in the music building every Monday without fail, usually staying until dinner time. Her playing was so beautiful that other students would often sit in the hallway just to listen. That evening, like always, the sound of classical music floated through the old building's hallways. Tchaikovsky, her favorite. But at 6:30 p.m., the music stopped suddenly, right in the middle of a piece. The abrupt silence caught the attention of a passing teacher who went to check on her. The practice room was empty. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor, which was strange. She was known for being incredibly organized with her music sheets. Near the basement stairs, they'd found a single shoe. Just one. It was sitting there as if someone had carefully placed it, not like it had fallen off. The shoe wasn't scuffed or dirty. It looked perfect, like it had been placed there on purpose. When they checked the security cameras, they saw her walking into the building at 5:45 p.m. But just like with the first disappearance, the cameras didn't show her leaving. The police response was faster this time. Within an hour, the music building was crawling with officers. They'd brought in the dogs again, but just like before, something strange happened. The dogs followed her scent down to the basement door, then refused to go further. They whined and backed away, something that made even the most experienced K-9 officers uncomfortable. The basement of the music building had always been creepy. It was full of old furniture and broken instruments, things the school had stored and forgotten about decades ago. But when the police searched it, they found something odd, fresh scrape marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been moved recently. The maintenance staff claimed they hadn't been down there in months. By now, parents were pulling their daughters out of school. Who could blame them? 2 girls missing in less than 3 months wasn't just bad luck, it was terrifying. The school board called emergency meetings. They hired security consultants, added new locks to every door, and made students wear tracking devices on their ID cards. But it all felt like closing the barn door after the horses had already escaped. The local police chief started looking into Ravenwood's history, digging through old files and interviewing former students. What he found was disturbing. Back in the 1950s, 3 students had gone missing over the course of a school year. The cases were never solved, and somehow they'd been kept out of the newspapers. The school had managed to bury the story completely. Students started sharing stories they'd been too scared to tell before, like the strange lights they'd seen in the administration building late at night, long after it should have been empty. All the weird sounds coming from behind the walls, sounds like footsteps, but in places where there shouldn't be any corridors. One girl even claimed she'd seen a hidden door in the library, but when she went back to look for it the next day, the whole shelf had been rearranged. The missing pianist's room became a kind of shrine. Her roommate left everything exactly as it was, the unmade bed, the coffee cup still sitting on the desk, the calendar showing all her planned performances for the year. On her desk, there was a letter she'd started writing to her little sister, telling her how excited she was about an upcoming winter concert. She'd never get to play in that concert. As winter deepened, the fear grew stronger. Girls started reporting strange things. Shadows moving when they shouldn't, footsteps following them down empty hallways, doors that were supposed to be locked standing open. The school brought in counselors to talk about anxiety and mass hysteria, but everyone knew this was something more. 2 girls don't just vanish into thin air. The police investigation seemed to hit wall after wall. Every promising lead turned into a dead end. Security camera footage would mysteriously corrupt. Witnesses would suddenly change their stories. Even the weather worked against them. A heavy snowstorm wiped away any traces that might have been left around the music building. Nobody knew it then, but the worst was still to come. The pattern was clear now. Someone was targeting Ravenwood students. But why? What connected these 2 girls? And who would be next? In the quiet halls of the old school, as winter winds howled outside, everyone was asking the same question: who could they really trust? March brought early spring rains to Ravenwood, but the dark clouds hanging over the school had nothing to do with weather. 2 missing students had been enough to make national news. Nobody expected a third disappearance. Nobody wanted to believe it could happen again, but it did. This time, the victim was a sophomore who wrote for the school newspaper. She wasn't just any reporter, she was known for digging deep into stories that others wouldn't touch. In the weeks before she vanished, she'd been acting strange. Her friends said she'd become jumpy, always looking over her shoulder. She told her roommate she'd discovered something big about the school's history, something that made her afraid to sleep at night. The day she disappeared, she'd told her best friend she was going to the administration building to check some old records. "If I'm not back in 2 hours," she'd said, "tell someone where I went." Those words would later haunt everyone who heard them. She knew something was wrong. She knew she was in danger. But by the time anyone realized she was missing, it was already too late. The administration building was one of the oldest structures on campus, a maze of narrow hallways and creaky floors. In the restricted archives section, they found her notebook lying open on a desk. Several pages had been torn out, leaving just tiny scraps of paper stuck in the binding. On the last remaining page, she'd written just 2 words: "Found them." This time, the FBI got involved. They weren't taking any chances. 3 missing girls in 6 months was no coincidence. They turned the campus upside down, interviewing every student, teacher, and staff member. They brought in forensic teams with high-tech equipment, but just like before, the trail seemed to go cold the moment it got interesting. One of the FBI agents noticed something strange about the administration building's blueprints. The measurements didn't add up. There seemed to be extra space between some of the walls, space that couldn't be accounted for. When they'd brought in scanning equipment, they found what looked like passages behind the walls. But when they tried to find the entrances, they hit nothing but solid brick. The missing girls' investigation had led her to dig through yearbooks from the 1950s. The FBI had found her research notes scattered around her room. She'd circled certain names, drawn connecting lines between events. And in the margins of one page, she'd written, "It's happening again. Same pattern, same places. Why doesn't anyone see it?" Students started coming forward with stories about the girl's last few days. One remembered seeing her talking to an old janitor who'd worked at the school for decades, but when the FBI tried to find him, they discovered he quit his job and disappeared the day after the girl went missing. Another student recalled seeing lights in the administration building at 3 a.m., even though the building was supposed to be locked at night. The school tried to keep things quiet, but rumors spread like wildfire. Someone found an old newspaper article from 1953 that mentioned 3 missing students, but when they went back to look for it again, the article had been removed from the library's archives. The school claimed it was never there in the first place, but too many people had seen it. Parents started demanding answers. How could 3 girls vanish from one of the most expensive and supposedly secure schools in the country? Why were security cameras always seeming to malfunction at crucial moments? And why did the school board keep blocking attempts to search certain parts of the campus? The investigation took a strange turn when they found a hidden door in the archives room, concealed behind a heavy bookshelf. It led to a narrow staircase going down, way down, deeper than any basement should go. But before they could explore it, there was a mysterious fire in that section of the building. The school claimed it was electrical, but the fire investigators weren't so sure. The missing reporter's room became another crime scene. Her wall was covered with photos and sticky notes, a timeline she'd been building. The FBI photographed everything, but before they could analyze it all, someone broke in and destroyed most of it. The only thing left intact was a single photo from 1953 showing a group of teachers standing in front of the garden maze. On the back, she'd written, "Look at their faces. They knew." As spring rain pounded against the windows of Ravenwood, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. But beneath the surface, things were starting to unravel. The girl had found something in those archives, something big enough to get her silenced. And whatever it was, it connected all 3 disappearances not just to each other, but to something much older and darker in Ravenwood's past. The truth about Ravenwood started coming out in pieces, like a puzzle slowly taking shape. It began when the FBI brought in a specialist who knew how to read old buildings. She spent days walking the halls, tapping on walls, and measuring rooms. What she found changed everything. The whole school had been built like a maze, with hidden passages that weren't on any blueprint. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A former student from the 1950s saw the news about the missing girls and realized she couldn't stay quiet anymore. She was in her 80s now, but her hands shook as she told the FBI about what she'd seen all those years ago. About the girls who disappeared then, just like now. About the teachers who pretended nothing was wrong. About the sounds she heard late at night coming from behind the walls. The FBI team started looking closer at the old yearbooks, the same ones the missing reporter had been studying. They found something strange. Every few decades, there was a pattern. 3 girls would vanish, always in the same order. First, a student who spent lots of time in a library. Then, someone musical. Finally, someone who asked too many questions. It had happened in the 1920s, the 1950s, and now again. Deep in the school's archives, hidden behind a false wall, they found a leather-bound book. It was like a secret record, keeping track of something terrible. Inside were photos of teachers from different years, all wearing the same strange pin, a tiny silver maze. At first, the FBI thought it was just a school tradition, but then they realized it was something much worse. It was a mark of membership in a secret group that had been running the school for over 100 years. The tunnels under the school turned out to be more than just service passages. They'd formed a massive network, like a spider web spreading under the whole campus. Some were old steam tunnels from when the school was first built. Others were newer, dug in secret over many years. The strangest part: some tunnels had electric lights that were still warm to the touch, even though the school claimed they hadn't been used in decades. One of the FBI agents interviewed an old maintenance worker who'd retired years ago. He remembered something odd from his first week on the job in the 1970s. He'd been fixing a pipe in the basement when he heard voices coming from behind a wall. When he told his boss, he was moved to working outside grounds only. He never went in the basement again, but he never forgot what he heard: someone crying and someone else saying nobody will ever find them here. The investigation uncovered more dark secrets. In the school's financial records, they found large payments made to construction companies every 30 years or so, always after students had disappeared. The companies were all fake, just names on paper. But the money was real, millions of dollars, all going somewhere secret. Then they found the photos. Hidden in a locked drawer in the headmistress's office was a stack of old pictures. They showed groups of teachers and school board members meeting in secret, always at night, always wearing those silver maze pins. In one photo from 1953, they were carrying something down to the tunnels. When the FBI enhanced the image, they could see it was a girl's shoe, the same kind the school still used as part of its uniform. The current headmistress tried to destroy records when the FBI got too close. They caught her shredding documents in her office at midnight. Among the papers they managed to save was a list of names, students who had disappeared over the years, going back to when the school first opened. Next to each name was a strange symbol and the words "payment received." Some of the older teachers started talking, scared of what the FBI might find. They revealed that certain members of the school board belonged to old, powerful families. These families had been using the school for something terrible, something that needed to be hidden underground. The tunnels weren't just for getting around, they were for keeping secrets. A geology professor from a nearby university made another discovery. The ground under Ravenwood was full of caves, natural tunnels that had been there for millions of years. The school's founders hadn't chosen this location by accident. They'd built here because the caves made it easy to hide things or people where they'd never be found. As the FBI dug deeper, they realized this wasn't just about missing students. It was about power, money, and dark secrets passed down through generations. The school's prestigious reputation had been built on something horrible, and the truth was finally coming to light. But they still hadn't found the missing girls, and time was running out. Somewhere in those tunnels, in the darkness beneath Ravenwood, 3 young students were waiting to be found. The breakthrough in the case came from the most unexpected place: an old groundskeeper who'd kept quiet for 40 years. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. One rainy morning, he walked into the FBI's temporary office on campus and placed a small silver pin on the desk. It was shaped like a maze, just like the ones in the old photos. "I've been tending these grounds since 1983, he said, his hands shaking as he spoke. "I've seen things, heard things, things that no one should ever have to see." He told them about the late-night meetings in the old groundskeeper's cottage, about the strange sounds that echoed up from beneath the garden maze, about the packages delivered in the dead of night. The groundskeeper explained how the school's secret society really worked. They called themselves the Guardians of the Maze, and they'd been operating since the school opened. They weren't just teachers and administrators, they included powerful people from all over the country. Judges, politicians, business leaders. People who could make problems disappear. He drew them a map of the tunnel system from memory. It wasn't just random passages, it was designed like a giant maze, mirroring the one in the garden above ground. Some tunnels led nowhere, dead ends designed to confuse anyone who managed to get in. But others led to secret rooms, hidden laboratories, and storage spaces that had been used for decades. The FBI brought in special equipment, ground-penetrating radar and thermal cameras. They found something disturbing. Under the old groundskeeper's cottage, there was a room that shouldn't exist. It was giving off heat signatures, meaning it was being used. Recently, when they searched the cottage, they found modern security cameras hidden behind old furniture. The cameras were watching the garden maze, but they weren't connected to the school's security system. They fed to somewhere else. In the basement, behind a shelf full of garden tools, they found a heavy metal door with an electronic lock. The groundskeeper told them about the night the first girl disappeared. He'd seen two teachers carrying something wrapped in a blanket from the library to the cottage. They thought no one was watching, but he saw them punch in a code and disappear behind that metal door. He was too scared to say anything then. These people had ways of making problems disappear. Surveillance footage from the new security system showed unusual activity around the cottage. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., someone would enter carrying supplies. Food, water, medical equipment. They were keeping someone alive down there. But why? The groundskeeper had a theory that chilled everyone who heard it. The society believes in old magic, he explained. They think the school was built on special ground that holds power. Every 30 years they need to feed that power, keep it strong. They choose girls who fit certain patterns. The scholar, the musician, the truth seeker. It's always the same. The FBI planned their raid carefully. They couldn't risk alerting anyone inside the tunnel system. They'd brought in special ops teams, medical personnel, and experts in underground rescue. The groundskeeper gave them the entry codes, his hands trembling as he wrote down the numbers he'd seen so many times, but never dared to use. When they finally breached the metal door, they found a high-tech security center hidden behind the old cottage walls. Monitors showed every corner of the school grounds. Filing cabinets held detailed records of every girl who'd disappeared since the 1920s. But most disturbing were the live camera feeds showing rooms deep underground, rooms that weren't empty. The tunnel system was like nothing they'd ever seen. Modern electrical systems had been installed inside the century-old passages. Some areas had been renovated into living quarters, with new walls hiding the old stone. They found a fully stocked medical facility, laboratories filled with strange equipment, and rooms full of files documenting decades of the society's activities. As they went deeper into the maze, following the groundskeeper's map, the passages got older and narrower. The air grew thick and damp. They could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, and something else, sounds that shouldn't be there so far underground. Voices, movement, signs of life. The rescue teams knew they were close. The heat signatures were stronger here. Behind one of these walls, 3 young girls were being held captive by a society that had managed to keep its dark secrets hidden for over 100 years. But the question remained, would they find them in time? And what would they discover about why they were really taken? The rescue happened at dawn. FBI teams moved through the underground maze, following the sound of humming, the same piece of music the missing pianist had been playing the day she disappeared. As they got closer, they could hear voices, the shuffle of footsteps, signs of life that shouldn't exist so far beneath the school. Behind a hidden door disguised as part of the stone wall, they found them. All 3 girls alive. They were being kept in a series of connected rooms that looked like a bizarre mix of a hospital and a prison. The rooms had beds, books, even a piano, as if someone had tried to make this underground nightmare feel like home. But the heavy locks on the doors told the real story. The girls were weak but alert. The youngest one, the reporter who'd discovered the truth, had kept a secret diary written on scraps of paper hidden in her mattress. It told a story that would shake the foundation of American education. The society hadn't just been kidnapping students, they'd been using the school as a front for decades of corruption and manipulation. The FBI raid didn't stop at the underground chambers. They moved simultaneously across the country, arresting members of the secret society. Judges, politicians, business leaders, people who'd worn those silver mace pins and kept the dark secrets of Ravenwood. Some had been students there themselves, drawn into the society's web of power and control. In the headmistress's private safe, they found evidence of what the society had really been doing. They weren't just kidnapping girls, they were using them as leverage. Each victim was chosen because their parents had stumbled onto something dangerous, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The society would take their daughters, then force the parents to stay quiet. The underground complex was bigger than anyone had imagined. Beyond the rooms where the girls were held, they found archives dating back to the 1920s. Files on every student who'd ever attended Ravenwood, detailed reports on their families, secrets that could destroy careers and lives. The society had been collecting information for generations, building a network of power based on fear and silence. The rescue made national headlines. News helicopters circled over Ravenwood as ambulances carried the girls to safety. Parents rushed to the hospital, crying tears of joy as they'd hugged their daughters for the first time in months. But the aftermath was just beginning. As the girls recovered, they started telling their stories. They talked about the strange rituals they'd witnessed, about society members in dark robes walking the tunnels at night. They described how they were kept apart at first, then allowed to see each other after weeks of isolation. The pianist had been forced to play music that was broadcast through hidden speakers in the school, a ghostly reminder to everyone above that the missing girls were still alive somewhere below. The reporter's investigation had gotten too close to the truth. She'd found old photos showing society members with missing girls from the 1950s. When they caught her in the archives that day, they had no choice but to take her too. But they didn't know she'd already mailed copies of her evidence to several newspapers. The packages arrived the same day the FBI raided the school. The case led to the biggest reform of private school oversight in American history. New laws were passed, named after the three survivors. Every school in the country had to install modern security systems with no blind spots or technical glitches. Underground spaces had to be mapped and regularly inspected. Secret societies were banned from all educational institutions. The survivors showed incredible strength. Instead of hiding from what happened, they spoke out. They wrote books, gave interviews, and started a foundation to help other victims of institutional abuse. The youngest one became an investigative journalist, exposing other schools with dark secrets. The pianist now performs benefit concerts to raise money for missing persons organizations. Ravenwood itself was closed forever. The buildings were torn down, the tunnels filled in with concrete. The only thing left standing was the garden maze, preserved as a memorial. The survivors insisted on keeping it, turning something that was meant to hide darkness into a symbol of light and truth. Today, the story of Ravenwood serves as a warning, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't hiding in the shadows, they're standing in plain sight, wearing expensive suits and respected titles. But it's also a story of hope, showing that no matter how powerful the people trying to hide the truth, there will always be brave souls willing to dig deeper, to ask questions, and to shine light into the darkest corners.